So, good evening. The title of my talk tonight is The Gift of Suffering. Bear with me one moment here. You know, it's often said, I often have comments from people that aren't following this path, that Buddhism focuses too much on suffering. All we talk about is suffering. Why don't we ever talk about happiness? And in other faith traditions, I think suffering there's a different way that it's managed and talked about. And perhaps it involves an afterlife or other ways of alleviating suffering in our lives. But in Buddhism, we talk about current suffering, the suffering that we experience day to day. The Buddha said that he taught two things. One, the existence of suffering and the alleviation of suffering. And when asked about other sort of broader questions, metaphysical questions, he basically said, I don't have time to think about it. I have enough to worry about just dealing with suffering. So it is true that we talk a lot about suffering. But I think the Four Noble Truths are hopeful, not pessimistic. I don't think that it's a pessimistic view of life or a pessimistic view of how do we deal with suffering in our lives. You recall that the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. This is from the Pali Canon of the Connected Discourses. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. Dukkha being the Pali word for suffering or dissatisfaction. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering, are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the five clinging aggregates are dukkha. Those being material form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, which we won't talk about tonight. So the Buddha talked not just about not to have us suffer, but rather to give us a path out of suffering. This is from the monk Tanarisaro Bhikkhu. But in addition, he says, quote, but in addition to pointing out the truth of suffering, the Buddha also taught the path to the end of suffering. This too is a truth. The Buddha has guaranteed that when we develop it in full measure, we'll gain release from stress and suffering. It's not the case that suffering is the only truth, that we have to lie buried in stress and suffering. The Buddha found a way out of suffering, like an intelligent doctor who not only understands diseases, but also knows a miraculous medicine to cure them, end quote. So I believe suffering is a gift, and I think that's the case because I think it really is one of our best teachers along this path. We spend a great deal of time and energy trying to avoid it, ignore it, run away from it, deny it, cover it up, even though our efforts are usually futile. It's always there when we slow down or get quiet. And I think one reason sometimes as we begin meditation it's hard is because we are quiet and our suffering really can become front and center. You know, we use drugs, we use alcohol, overwork, compulsive activity, compulsive shopping, compulsive eating. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we seek to alleviate or reduce our suffering. But these are all doomed to fail. And if we persist in these attempts, we'll be very limited on our path. We'll be very limited on our goal of reducing our suffering. You know, we have no problem with things that are pleasurable. You know, most of us welcome the 10,000 joys, but we'd rather do without the 10,000 sorrows. But it's just not part of the deal. So how, you might ask, is suffering a gift? How is suffering a teacher? Well, for one thing, it calls out for our attention until we can no longer ignore it. It's sort of like a toothache. It's hard to ignore. It keeps hurting until we decide to do something about it. And our suffering is a real wake-up call to pay attention to what's going on in our lives, to pay attention to what are the origins of our suffering. As I said a moment ago, the Pali word for suffering is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A. And it includes the obvious forms of suffering that we all experience, death, aging, and so forth. But it also includes the more subtle dissatisfactions of life. It also includes sort of the existential anxieties of life. You may know this quote from Oscar Wilde. He says, "There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it." I love that quote. And it's pretty obvious why we suffer when we don't get what we want. But why do we suffer when we do get what we want? What's the tragedy of that? Well, primarily it is that things never last. We become dissatisfied, the novelty wears off, we're right back on the hamster wheel, even when we get what we do want. So it's sort of be careful what you wish for. It's the old thing about unintended consequences. You may know this story. This is an old farmer who had worked his crops for many years, and one day his horse ran away. And upon hearing the news, his neighbors came over and said, "Such bad luck. We're so sorry." "Maybe," the farmer replied. The next morning, this horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. The neighbors heard this and exclaimed, "How fortunate, how wonderful." The old farmer says, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses. He was thrown off the horse and broke his leg. The neighbors came over and said, "That's terrible. We're really sorry for your misfortune." And the old farmer said, "Maybe." The day after, the military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army. Seeing that his son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbors congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out. "Maybe," said the old farmer. So one of the things that I think is really central to our experience of suffering or dukkha is impermanence, which we talk about a lot here. You know, when we get what we want and then we lose it, it goes away, the novelty wears off, we use it up, whatever. So the question, I think, and the challenge for us is, can we explore our suffering? Can we embrace it? Can we see what it can teach us? Can we do what Philip Moffat calls in his writing, penetrate our suffering? Not just acknowledge it, but penetrate it. Go into it, meet it head on. It's a tall order. I'll stipulate to that. And I know for me, over the course of my own practice, that without the faith that I could survive my suffering and survive periods of suffering, I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't want to deal with it. I wouldn't want to confront it. I had to believe in what the teachings convey about the alleviation of suffering. That if you meet it head on, that's the first step in dealing with it and beginning to reduce our suffering. This is Sharon Salzberg from her 2002 book entitled Faith. She says, quote, "The last time I led a program on faith, I heard people express disquietude, uneasiness, and even hostility. Somebody said to me, 'I came to Buddhism to get away from all this,' meaning faith. And for him, because of his own conditioning or background, the very word faith was difficult to hear. It brought up questions of being good enough and having enough faith. It brought up facing dire consequences if he didn't have enough faith or didn't have the right kind of faith. The word faith brought up a lot of fear rather than faith seeming like an antidote to fear. The word we normally translate as faith from the Pali language, the language of the original Buddhist text, is saddha, which literally means to place the heart upon. Saddha means to give our hearts over to it, to place our hearts upon something. Its meaning can vary a lot, depending on what we put our heart upon or the quality with which we give our hearts over. So there are a number of different ways that faith can be manifest," end quote. You know, very often in the West particularly, I think we feel ashamed of our suffering. We engage in a lot of self-blame and a lot of self-condemnation. What's wrong with me? Why am I not coping better? Why am I not dealing with this? Why me? But it really comes down to just causes and conditions over things we have no control over, just the way things unfold in our lives. So I want to just share a short story with you about two people and the trajectory of suffering as it can happen in our lives. And this could be anyone's story. But it really illustrates the fact that we can't control much of what happens to us, that suffering is not necessarily our fault. And there's no such thing as a life without suffering. It's just not going to happen. And that there's no shame and there's no defeat in our suffering. So this is a story of a young woman, 19 years old. She's from a very old family, deep South. Roots go way back in the South. Family had once owned a plantation, owned 100 slaves, from which they became very prosperous over the years. And she grew up in the South. Her father was an attorney. He had actually been born on the family plantation. And this young woman was very indulged, very spoiled, very entitled, very used to getting her way, very self-centered. And then there's a young man. He's approximately 22 years old. He's from Detroit, Michigan. He's the third generation German immigrant. His grandfather had come to the U.S. from Northeast Germany, never learned to speak English. And this young man was the only child of his parents' marriage. His father was a salesman who was gone much of the time. His mother was a severe chronic alcoholic. So he left Detroit right after high school to go to school in the South, actually in the Mid-Atlantic area. And right after graduating from college, he immediately joined the U.S. Navy. It was World War II, and went into an officer training program for the Navy. And as part of his training, he was sent to New Orleans to do one phase of his training as an officer in training. And on a particular Sunday afternoon in 1942, there was the young ladies of New Orleans, the proper young ladies, were giving a tea for the naval officers to be at the Pontchartrain Hotel. This was in essence, this was their war effort to offer this tea. So this young woman and this young man meet at this tea. Despite being from very different backgrounds, there really were some sparks, apparently, that flew. And very soon thereafter, he was transferred or he was sent to San Francisco to complete his training. And then that would be the final phase, after which he would then go to the South Pacific. He was to command a landing craft which would take Marines ashore on the islands where there were Japanese occupation. So he leaves, goes to San Francisco, and this young woman goes to her father and says, "I want to marry this fellow." And he was vehemently opposed, refused to give permission, denied her that option. But remember, this is a young woman that's very used to getting her own way. She's not used to taking no for an answer. She's very indulged. So she convinced her mother to ride with her on the train from New Orleans to San Francisco and marry this man before he ships out to the South Pacific, which is what happened. So she rides out, they go out, they get married, they have a brief honeymoon, and then he's off to the war. And then once the war was over, he returns to a wife and a daughter a wife who he barely knew, and a daughter he didn't know at all. And these people could not have been more different. They could not have been a worse match for each other in terms of their background, their personalities, the causes and conditions that informed who they are as individuals. And her father had really been right in opposing the marriage. Perhaps he'd done so for the wrong reasons, but he certainly was correct, I think, in thinking these two people should probably not end up together. But out of this union would come a great deal of suffering for all parties involved, for this couple and for their daughter and their other children. And if you think about this family, the metaphor I like is of a used car on a used car lot, and it's been detailed beautifully. I mean, it just shines. The hubcaps shine, the finish shines. It's beautiful inside and out. The problem is when you open the hood or try to start the car, nothing really works. You know, it misses and it won't start and the wiring's all screwed up. So it looks really good on the outside, but inside it's just not working. It's just really, really a mess. So it ends up, this couple, now that they eventually have 4 children, The man is a workaholic. He's largely gone. The mother's very self-absorbed, angry a lot about being saddled with these kids. And as you may have figured out by now, this is my story. But it's really anyone's story, because the point of it is that causes and conditions over which I had no control, over which they had no control, come together in these circumstances. It was wartime. Everybody was kind of in a frenzy. That's what probably caused them to have this connection, which was doomed to fail. And out of this, everyone in that family, all 6 people, suffered in their own way and continued to suffer in their own ways. And for me, it was really an experience of isolation, of loneliness, of confusion, of just being generally unhappy. There was lots of distance and fighting. But I thought as a young child or as a young boy that I figured it out. And what I figured out was that if I could just be perfect in every way, perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect behavior, perfect appearance, that I would be rewarded with all those things that I needed emotionally. But I had no names for. But I just knew something was missing. And if I just tried hard enough and kept trying hard enough and fixed those other little details, then the payoff would come. But it didn't. And here comes puberty, and here comes hormones. And all of a sudden, I'm incredibly angry. I'm incredibly angry that I've worked so hard to be perfect, and it didn't get me what I wanted. And so I break bad at that point. I start failing in school. I start hanging around with people that my parents disapproved of. I got kicked out of advanced classes and put back in the normal curriculum. I was getting into trouble. Just a real brief aside, it was sort of one of those moments of grace where my biology teacher recognized that myself and 2 of my friends were headed for nothing good. And she began taking us to volunteer one night a week at the old Western State Hospital in Stanton on the back wards. And in those days, the back wards were back wards. But it was really one of those things that changed the trajectory of my life. It got me interested in psychology. It sort of got me some purpose and some meaning. And that's a story for another time. But it was one of the things that sort of changed the outcome. But anyway, the point of this is that my story is not unique, and that we all experience plenty of suffering in our lives. And it's due to causes and conditions very often over which we have no control. Most of the time we have no control. So given this, what do we do with it? What do we do about it? What choices do we make in the face of this life that involves a great deal of suffering? Do we see our suffering as a gift to motivate us to seek a way out of our pain? Or do we just engage in behavior to try to cover it up, ignore it, run away from it, distract from it, all the things we do to pretend it's not there? And this is where the faith comes in again, because we have to have faith in our ability to weather this stuff, to weather the storms of our suffering. And in my own life, some of my deepest suffering has come from the issues in my family and from losses that were associated with that experience. And for years, I just wanted to bury my head in the sand and not open to it. I just wanted to distract myself. And pursuing all kinds of maladaptive ways to avoid my suffering for many years and into adulthood. And just, again, another one of those moments of grace, I found my way to this path, to the Dharma, after failing at all the other attempts to alleviate the suffering. Nothing had worked. Psychotherapy had helped, but it really hadn't done the job. Trying to be perfect hadn't worked. Being a compulsive runner hadn't worked. Just pick something, but it wasn't working. But the faith that once I believed this, and once I developed the faith that it wouldn't kill me to face this suffering, that I could learn to lean into it, that I could embrace it, I could face it, that's when things really begin to shift. That was when the gift of suffering really materialized in my life. And it was not faith in anything in terms of what Sharon Salzberg was talking about in any particular guru or any particular deity, it was really faith in the three refuges, taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And as I begin to practice this path and read and immerse myself in it and study and meditate, I begin to develop some clarity. I begin to develop some equanimity, something I'd never, ever had in my life before. And the clarity was about what is really true, what was really true in my life, and what is really true in our lives collectively. And a very important lesson for me was to finally accept that the opposite of suffering is not happiness, it's freedom. It's freedom. So what exactly does it mean to be present for our suffering, to show up for it? Well, it begins by saying, this is not bad, this is not wrong, I'm not defective. This is just the way things are. This is just what it is. And the key there is, I think, turning toward our dukkha, turning toward our suffering, to open to it and to open to our own experience and start to set down some of that baggage, all the ways we've tried to run from and distract from and avoid our suffering, setting that aside. And when we do that, we begin to develop space around our suffering. Our experience of it becomes more spacious. We see it in a much larger context. And my favorite metaphor for that is the one of, you put a teaspoon of salt in a glass of water and it's undrinkable. But if you put a teaspoon of salt in a lake, you don't even taste it. That's the spaciousness. And to not feel alone, to not think we're the only ones suffering, but to understand and embrace that we all suffer. It's part of the journey on this planet. It's an unavoidable part of it. And try as we might, we can't get rid of it. We can only learn to dance with it, as Philip Moffat says. None of us get a pass. None of us get a free pass on dukkha. We accept it. We accept it as that's the way things are. And again, I think in the West we have this tendency to feel ashamed of our suffering. I must be weak. Why am I not coping? It's one of the ways we most judge ourselves, I think. And there's where the practice of self-compassion is so important. To accept that the suffering is not our fault, that it's those causes and conditions. That no one in my family set out to make anyone else suffer, but what they brought to the table just kept it going. So what comes of this when we allow suffering to be our teacher? What do we learn? What happens as we embrace this? Well, one of the things that I think is really important that comes out of this is the cultivation of wisdom. The wisdom of seeing life as it really is, not as I want it to be, but how it really is. That's so critical. The wisdom that allows us to let go of some of our clinging and to our notion of wanting things to be as we want them, not as they are. The suffering that comes from clinging to the idea that things should be the way I want them. But it's an active process. It's not a passive process. It's not something that happens without effort, without our engagement, without our leaning into it, without our embracing it. If we sit around and wait for it to happen, it won't. We have to pursue it. This is from Pema Chodron. She says, quote, "Whatever you're experiencing, don't try to make it go away. Working with adverse circumstances, not avoiding them or trying to distract myself from them, has helped me to wake up more in my life, to be there more for other people, and to be happier." So I think there are two important results, if you will, of embracing our suffering, of leaning into it, of accepting it. The first is to reduce our own suffering by acceptance of things, by accepting that things are the way they are. We have openness, we have wisdom, we have spaciousness. But the second is to reduce the suffering of those around us who are subjected to our unskillful means. Because when we suffer and we act out, we make other people in our sphere suffer. So by embracing it, by meeting it head on, by accepting it, not only does my own suffering reduce, but the suffering of those I love and the people I care about, because I'm not acting unskillfully and causing them pain and suffering, and on top of what they're experiencing in their own life. And I think that's critical. I think that's such an important part of understanding the importance of what our suffering can teach us. This is again from the Pali Canon. By protecting oneself, one protects others. By protecting others, one protects oneself. You know, in 12-step programs, folks that are in various recovery programs, they talk of hitting a bottom. And until you hit that bottom, you really can't start your recovery. But to me, that means coming face to face with one's suffering. That hitting a bottom really means, okay, I'm going to see my suffering as it is in all its ugliness or all its whatever manifestations. And only then can my recovery begin. And whether that's recovery from drugs or alcohol or whatever, hitting that bottom, facing that suffering is the critical juncture, critical fork in the road. You know, and without the suffering in my own life, which took all the many forms, some of which I described, you know, I don't think I would have been drawn to this practice. But when I first was exposed to it and began to read and study and think about it, it just resonated so deeply with it. Just with the teachings on suffering and the path out of suffering. It just made such sense to me. It spoke to me in a way that no belief system or anything I'd ever been exposed to had ever spoken to me in that same way. And part of it was an acknowledgement of that sense of separation, that aloneness, feeling like I was the only person that was suffering this isolation and separation and feeling deeply ashamed of it, not wanting anyone to know about it, trying really hard to wear that mask and not have anyone see my suffering because I thought I was weak and ineffective for having it. And all of a sudden I'm reading the stuff and it's saying, no, you know, this is part of the deal. You're not the only one. You know, I think so much of our suffering comes from that experience of isolation, that experience of separation, self-induced, that we walk around pretending that everything's hunky-dory. You know, we tend to feel guilty and ashamed in the West if we feel defective, if we're not meeting that Western ideal of perfection. And it's everywhere. I mean, it's in the advertisements, it's in what people sell us, it's in the obsession with celebrity, it's just everywhere. Those people are perfect. What's wrong with me? And again, the teachings just spoke to me in a way that nothing ever had. And I just knew at that point, very soon after I began to look at this stuff, that I'd found my home spiritually. This is really where my heart needed to be. You know, it provided me a framework, a context in which my suffering finally began to make sense. Finally, something was now able to explain that to me. It helped me see the sources of my suffering, most of which were self-induced, and all the things that I was doing to perpetuate it, to keep it going. And of the many things that this path has offered me is the compassion, to feel some compassion for my own suffering. And out of that, then being able to feel compassion for the suffering of others. I think we have to start with our own suffering and cultivating compassion, because I think that self-compassion is critical to healing our own suffering, and then from there we can extend it to others. So if we let it, if we allow it, our suffering can be the gift that teaches us, that points us toward compassion for self, that points us toward wisdom, can point us toward compassion for others. Because I believe compassion comes of suffering. I don't think without it, without acknowledging it, without facing it, can we truly cultivate compassion. It is an effect of embracing that suffering and acknowledging it. When I talked to Pat in early 2010 or 11 about participating in the teacher training program that they were going to be offering in Washington, I remember thinking that I wanted to pursue that because I wanted to introduce this path to others. I wanted to be able to share it. I had such gratitude for this path in terms of my own suffering and knowing that if it could work for me, it could work for anybody. It's like, listen, folks, I'm a tough customer. If this stuff can impact my life, I promise it can impact yours if you follow this path. Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus. By which he acknowledges that because suffering can feel so bad, the mud, we try to run from it, cover it up, distract, consume, whatever. We find something to eat, we turn on the TV, we go for a run. But he says that unless we're able to face our suffering, we can't be present and available to life, and the freedom will continue to elude us. There will be no lotus. So you have got to have the mud to get the lotus. That's the deal. He goes on to say, quote, we can be in touch with suffering without being overwhelmed by it. When we know how to suffer, we suffer much, much less. Close quotes. I love this teaching by Pema Chodron, and I don't have the exact quote, but she talks about when our suffering seems overwhelming, that we just have to sort of touch into it in tolerable amounts. We don't have to go full tilt 100%. We can just nibble at it a little bit and allow it to become more and more tolerable as we just nibble at it. We don't have to just fall into the pit head first. So I'd like to just take a minute, if you would indulge me here, and do a brief reflection. So if you just get comfortable, close your eyes, and bring to mind one of the ways that you suffer or feel, or maybe more specifically, something about which you're self-critical. Just it could be anything. I'm always late, I talk too much, I talk too little, I'm shy, I'm uncomfortable, just whatever. Just sit with that for a moment and just allow yourself to feel that. Now, imagine, if you will, a feeling compassion for someone or something else that is suffering. It might be a person, an animal, a child. Just shift into feeling compassion for that other person, that other animal, that child. Just open your heart to that person. And now, staying with that compassion, imagine feeling the compassion from those who love you and how they would feel toward you if they knew you were suffering. Just imagine that person who loves you feeling compassion for your suffering. Now, holding on to that compassionate heart that you're feeling, move that compassion onto that aspect of suffering that you brought to mind a few minutes ago. Keep your heart open. Try to offer that kindness to yourself, to that part of yourself. And now just notice if you feel differently about that aspect of your suffering. Okay. So I would really encourage you to make self-compassion part of your regular practice. Just include it. You can include it at the beginning. Just extend feelings of compassion toward yourself, toward your suffering. It's a very powerful practice. Several years ago on a retreat, a teacher advised me to start that practice, the self-compassion practice. And I was initially skeptical, but when I went back to that retreat a year later and was asked about it again, it was clear that it had had a profound impact in my life. So I really encourage self-compassion practice. Now I just wanted to mention one caveat to this business of suffering. And that is the tendency that sometimes we have to become a martyr, to sort of fuse that suffering with our ego, to feel that our suffering is worse than anyone else's, to sort of see it as a virtue, to sort of wear that suffering as a badge of honor. Because we can go there. I mean, it's something we do. My favorite example of this is a short story by Franz Kafka called The Hunger Artist. And if you don't know the story, I really recommend it, but I just wanted to read one paragraph of a translation. And so his reason for being is that he lives in a cage on a stage and he starves himself. And that's his claim to fame. That's the thing of which he takes great pride. So it says, the period of fasting was set by his impresario at 40 days maximum, because after that, the public began to lose interest. So on the 40th day, with an excited crowd filling the arena and a military band playing, 2 young ladies came to lead the hunger artist out of his cage. When this happened, he always put up some resistance. Why stop after only 40 days? Why should they take from him the glory of fasting even longer, or surpassing even himself to reach unimaginable heights? For he saw his ability to go on fasting as unlimited. So again, just know that that's suggestive of the tendency that we all might have at times to make our suffering a virtue, or to give us the moral high ground. Ajahn Sumedho, the Buddhist monk, says that to truly understand suffering, we must be willing to stand under suffering. Sort of the image of a rain shower. And what he's pointing to there is our capacity to consciously, fully meeting life as it is, not as we want it to be. And to experience our suffering as a gift that points us toward the freedom that awaits us if we follow this path, if we follow the Buddha's prescription, Buddha, the brilliant doctor. Because we suffer when life is not as we want it to be. And when we accept life as it is, all the joys, all the sorrows, that's the key. So I just want to finish with a poem by Dana Falls called Allow. She says, there is no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in. The wild with the weak, fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of the heart, or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. And the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your eyes. So thank you. Let's just sit for a minute. So thank you for your time and attention. Have a good week.